sure that you were reading the material and that you understood the material that you were reading. This question could kind of go either way based on the doctrine that you decided to use and based on how persuasive your arguments were. There's no straight cut answer in this one. It actually gave you a chance to be creative using the different doctrines that were listed in your book. So let's go through this one. It says Brian convinces his friend Joe, who prefers to stay home and play video games all day, to go for a hike in the woods one sunny afternoon. During the hike, Brian jokingly pushes Joe, and Joe falls over a ravine and suffers severe injuries. Feeling terrible, Brian carries Joe on his back all the way to the nearest hospital and leaves him in the emergency room. After Brian leaves, Joe decides to go to the restroom under his own power and passes out. Joe eventually dies from internal bleeding in the emergency room bathroom. Is Brian the proximate cause of Joe's death? Why or why not? Explain what doctrine, if any, applied. Okay. Now, in this one, we know that we are dealing with the proximate cause issues. Okay, so we're not going to address factual causation. I mean, you won't lose any points if you did, but we're more focused on the proximate cause or the legal cause. And the problem asks you to explain what doctrine, if any, applied. Okay, so we know that proximate causation deals with who should be held criminally responsible. Okay, and in addition to that, we know that if there is an intervening cause that is responsible for a resulting harm, we know that the defendant may not be the legal cause or the proximate cause of the said injury. And like I said before, this is because the court determines that something else is a superseding cause that had a bigger stake in the resulting injury than the defendant. Okay, so you have to decide whether or not Brian pushing him or Joe deciding to go into the bathroom where no one can see him and bleed to death played a bigger role in his death. So, was it what Brian did or what Joe did that played the bigger role in his death? Okay, so that's what you can use to determine whether or not the intervening cause was more substantial than the initial cause. All right, so it talks about doctrines, and we know that we have seen 3 doctrines here with respect to proximate cause liability. There is the apparent safety doctrine. There is the substantiality of the intervening cause doctrine, which is what I just addressed. And then there is the voluntary victim intervention doctrine. Okay, so if we are going to say that Brian is not the proximate cause of Joe's death, we can use the apparent safety doctrine and the voluntary victim intervention doctrine to support that. And that is what Brian's attorneys would use in order to try to absolve Brian of any liability. Like I said earlier in the lecture, the apparent safety doctrine holds that a defendant is not the legal cause of a resulting harm if the victim reaches a place of apparent safety. at which point an intervening cause of harm comes into play. Remember, with that example, we talked about the man who had the argument with his wife. He beat her, drove her to her father's house, and left. But then she, of her own will, decided to stay outside and fall asleep in the cold, and she died from freezing to death. And in that case, the husband was not held liable because he got her to a place of apparent safety. Here, Brian can argue that he should not be held criminally liable for Joe's death because he got him to a place of apparent safety. He got him to the hospital emergency room. That is a place that place is considered a place of apparent safety. He got him to the emergency room. He didn't just leave him in the ravine for him to die of his injuries. He actually picked him up, put him on his back, and took him to the hospital, which is an apparent place that's safe. So, under the apparent safety doctrine, the court may decide that, hey, Brian got Joe to a place of apparent safety. Joe, is the one that decided to get up and go to the bathroom where nobody could see him and pass out from blood loss and died in the bathroom. That has nothing to do with Brian. Brian got him to the hospital. So that's under the apparent safety doctrine. Then there is the voluntary victim intervention doctrine, which may also be of interest to Brian's attorney. That doctrine says that an offender cannot be held liable if his or her victim acts in a free, voluntary, and informed manner that leads to the resulting harm. Brian's attorney would argue that Joe acted in a free, voluntary, and informed manner when he got up and entered the restroom. And the facts of this question says that. It says after Brian leaves, Joe enters the restroom under his own power and passes out. So under his own power indicates to us that Joe acted in a free and voluntary manner. He also acted in an informed manner. There's nothing in the facts to lead us to believe that Joe had any kind of mental impairments or deficiencies or anything of that nature. So we can reasonably infer that in addition to acting freely and voluntarily, he acted in an informed manner, and his acts led to the resulting harm. He bled to death, and he bled to death because no one could see him. He was no longer in the waiting room where Brian dropped him off. He was now in the restroom where no medical personnel were able to see him. So, under the apparent safety doctrine and the voluntary victim intervention doctrine, Brian may be able to escape liability. But for those of you who said that Brian is the proximate cause of Joe's death, we can examine the substantiality of the intervening cause, okay? And it says here in your book that if an intervening cause is substantially more significant than the actual cause, the defendant may escape criminal liability. But if you believe that Brian is the proximate cause, then you would argue that Brian's act was more substantial than the intervening cause, which was Joe's going into the bathroom and passing out. But then again, keep in mind, Brian's attorney may argue that the intervening cause, which is Joe going into the bathroom and passing out, is more significant than the actual cause, which is Brian pushing Joe and resulting in him falling into the ravine. So if I had to choose, I would say that Brian is not the proximate cause of Joe's death based on these doctrines here. But if someone did say that Brian was in fact the proximate cause of Joe's death, then I would expect you to have explained your answer using the substantiality of the intervening cause. So that is it for chapters 1 to 3 and discussions 1.2 and 1.3. If anyone else has any questions about any of the information that we discussed or that I discussed in this lecture, please feel free to email me and I can try to set up a one-on-one with you to go over any issues that you may have in more detail. Okay, but in summary, I just want to highlight again for your discussion questions, Brennan cannot be charged with first-degree murder, and it is more than likely that Brian is not the proximate cause of Joe's death based on the doctrines that we have here in chapter 3, but I will entertain an answer stating that Brian was the proximate cause if I feel like your analysis was strong enough using the substantiality of the intervening cause doctrine. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you have a great week.